All right, are we good to go? Peace, peace, peace. I am Phillip Roundtree, and you are tuned into the May 4th edition of Rhetorically Speaking. Listen, salute to those who are watching on Facebook Live. Appreciate you. Shout out to those who will be watching this tomorrow on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. And as always, if you want to donate a couple dollars to a brother, I'm gonna be running it throughout the show. Cash App, Quadify LLC, QUAD as in dog, EFY LLC. And again, Quadify LLC is how you can subscribe on YouTube. I wish I had my Dr. Umar video to play just so y'all know. Because listen, y'all getting real information, like he said. Y'all getting real information, so we need to be compensated. I hate saying it, right? I hate blatantly asking people for money, right? But this helps me continue on a day-to-day basis. I'm not getting paid for this. I saw Roland Martin do it so eloquently today. He's like, please donate to Roland Martin Unfiltered. This helps keeps it alive. And I'm like, listen, I got to eat, baby. You know what I mean? So if y'all want me to eat so I can be here tomorrow for you guys, listen, please make sure you hit that donate button. But no, tonight, we're touching on a serious topic, one that's near and dear to my heart. So if this is your first time tuning in to Rhetorically Speaking, on Mondays we have the hashtag You Good Man Mondays. Hashtag You Good Man started as a bi-weekly safe space for men to have healthy conversation. It's a space for men to vent, to receive pushback, to learn, and to heal. When I first started doing like radio, even though I consider this radio, even though I call it a daily digital show, when I was actually on the FM dial, I wanted to be able to extend that conversation to the airwaves because I get so many people who are like, yo, what do y'all talk about in the group? And so if it's men or people who identify as men, I always say, listen, come through. Come through. You can participate. You can be a part of it. If it's women, nah, unfortunately, you can't come. But I was just like, you know what? This will be a great opportunity for them to see and hear how it is that we truly feel on certain topics. So you can hear the work that's attempting to be done, right? I wanted to give y'all a glimpse into the world. Not the personal experiences that you're used to with the men that you know or how society portrays us, but who we are, right? We're breathing, thinking human beings. And so again, that continues today. Now this topic, I'm gonna let you know where this topic stemmed from. I wanted to have a real conversation on rape culture, right? I was listening to a podcast. Everybody know who my favorite rapper is of all time, him and Kanye. And people gonna be like, "Yo, what's up with your two favorite rappers?" But Joe Budden. Joe Budden is one of my favorite rappers, and he has this podcast. Listen, he not paying me for this promotion, so we're gonna keep it moving. But in listening to the conversation that they were having about a mutual friend and acquaintance of theirs, that the conversation was on accountability, it was on rape culture, it was on consent, and it was on allyship. When I first was listening to it, I started to cringe because I was like, yo, this is toxic. But then I had to take a step back. I had to take a step back and recognize, you know what? I wasn't always this advanced, this informed, right? You know how new Christians are, right? When they a babe in Christ. Now, listen, I ain't going into it. This ain't about beliefs, about religion or what have you. But you know how they are. You might have been drinking on Saturday, but as soon as you get saved and baptized on Sunday, you start looking down on the people who were doing the things that you once did. And so I had to check myself. I had to show them some grace. Because yes, on the continuum, when we talk about rape culture and consent, I may be a little quote unquote further along, but I don't know what their experiences were. But the fact they were able to just have this conversation on such a huge platform, I found it to be something that was needed, something that was necessary. And now my thing was, how can I help push this conversation forward? And so with that, I've reached out to several people, several brothers of mine who I know are really out here doing the work when we talk about men's wellness, men's mental health, emotional well-being, spiritual and physical. And it was just like, I need these brothers to come on so we can have this conversation, right? So again, so we could take it another step forward. We're going to try to bring in Brother Tyrone right now real quick. Let's see. Brother Tyrone, you with us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh man, beautiful, man, beautiful. I was nervous. I was
Sounds
nervous.
better now.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And so with that, I'm gonna get into the introduction of our guest for the day. So the brother who I just welcome in is Mr. Tyrone Melvin, who's a community outreach specialist. He's trained in sexual assault counseling, and he's a survivor. So I appreciate you having you here, brother. We
Thank
have
you.
Dr. Charles Corporal, who's the host of the Western Revolution podcast. He is based in New Orleans, Louisiana. I still haven't made it out there, but these flights is about $52 right round trip, so I might have to take a trip down there. So peace to you, brother. Thank you for joining us.
Man, I'm excited to be here with you, brother.
No doubt, no doubt. We have Mr. Jason Rosario. He is the creator, founder of the Lives of Men and the Hey Jason podcast. Peace to you, brother.
My God, thanks for having me. Appreciate
No
it.
doubt, no doubt. We have our professional Negro dancer and creator. See, and I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna say Negro dancer, but I feel like the people know every Monday for since what? Zane's January.
Yeah.
Since January, I've been calling you that. So now we have professional dancer and creator, Mr. Zane Booker, in the building. Peace, Zane.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
And last but certainly not least, we have the good brother Michael Olnick, master's level social worker in the building. Peace, Mike. How you?
Good, good. Always good to be out here with you.
No doubt, no doubt. So, are you enjoying this? Graduate, having graduated from Temple University the last few weeks. Have you been enjoying your time, your
Yeah,
downtime?
yeah. I mean, it's been kind of weird because it's a graduation without a graduation, so it was kind of an end without an ending. So it's been kind of strange, but it is done. I did complete it. They will be sending me a degree, so it is real.
Yeah, yeah. So, but you haven't gotten it yet.
No, they haven't
Okay.
hit with me with it
All right.
yet.
Yeah. Well, make sure you get that because oh, when we see that degree, that's just money. You know what I mean? It's just
The receipt.
money that that's
The receipt.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a big receipt. So again, brothers, we're gonna dive right into it, right? Just into this idea of rape culture. Now, and I sent you guys the link of the podcast. Not sure if you had the opportunity to listen, but I do want to get your initial thoughts on just that topic of rape culture, if indeed you had the opportunity to listen to the podcast, and then rape culture in general. So, I guess we'll start with you, Tyrone, since this is definitely your specialty, your niche.
I actually didn't get a chance to review the video, but I do understand the consent and the rape culture and how it's impacting our communities, devastating our communities, and how uh, that kind of toxic behavior has been normalized and perpetuated, and how it looks in the Black community. I think it's great that we have various men from different backgrounds talking about consent and how the rape culture impacts us as a whole, as a collective, and how it destroys communities. Definitely.
Word, word. So, can you delve into a little bit of just what exactly rape culture is from a professional
So, for
standpoint?
I don't know that I would look at it from a professional standpoint, but I'll say consent is anything that that you give permission to as it relates to the word. Yes, anything that's if yes is never given as permission, then the opposite of that would be no. When it comes to rape, there's various types of rapes. There's little nuances that go into that, and so we as men, we're unaware of how our behavior are impacting the women, how we inappropriately touch them, or how we think that something that was consented to the first time is automatic the second time. And so, we hear terms like you drawing if the man doesn't get the response or the reaction that he got the first time. And so I have to repeatedly remind brothers that sex is something that should be consented to every time. And just because a woman consent to an act one particular time, it doesn't mean that it's automatic. Everything should be consented to repeatedly, because we all have moods. It's like it's like taking a bike ride. You can't just go pick up somebody else's bike and just ride it. You have to get permission. And so there's little nuances, little languages, understanding body languages, understanding when someone looks discomfort. We have to talk about all these different things because these things play into rape. And that word rape is kind of broad. It's not just this little small thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jason, I want to get to you
Yeah.
because I know you do a lot of work with men and the idea of masculinity. Those who know me know I hate the term toxic masculinity because at the end of
We
the
know
day,
you do.
and I always preface it by saying that because at the end of the day, we're talking about what does it take to be a healthy human being, right? And what behaviors it takes to be a healthy human being. So some are unhealthy, some are unhealthy. But again, we're arguing semantics. But when we talk about this idea of men and masculinity and just this overarching idea of rape culture, what has been your experience just when we talk about those behaviors, those ideas that impact how men that you've worked with see the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an incredibly important topic, and I think just to take a step back to understand, to help whoever's watching this that might be new to this conversation, maybe understand a little bit about why it's so sensitive and why it's so top of mind for us right now. And that is because for men, the ways that we've been socialized almost like a rite of passage, if you will, that the conquering of women, as it were, and sex and physicality and coming into our own in that way is something to be celebrated. And without we get that and we get those messages without a clear set of rules and a clear set of what is healthy behavior in this space as it relates to men and women engaging. And so when you think about why men are so confused at a time like this, where post Me Too, not to say that we're in a post Me Too world, I think Me Too is the world, right? Like this new normal is the world that we live in. I think why men are so confused is because they're questioning not only past actions, but they're also questioning instances in which in the past they didn't have to think about consent, right? So they're asking questions like, I'm at work, can I not compliment someone? I'm on a date and I was told that the initial kind of no is like a permission or an invitation to continue forward, right? And if you don't continue forward, that's almost an indictment on you and your manlyhood, right? So all of these things are learned behaviors that we have to help men take a step back and unpack and understand where it comes from so that we can start to really engage them in a conversation that is healthy and productive as it relates to what our roles are now, given the new normal that we live in, and help men understand what our responsibility is more important in policing our own behaviors and each other's behaviors as it relates to how we relate to women. So there's a context here that I think is important for men to understand before we start moving and trying to help remedy behaviors, if you will.
Word. What I want to do right now is I want to post this this diagram up, and those who are watching, you'll be able to see it as well. It's a rape culture diagram. And I I'll talk about my issues with the diagram a little bit later in the conversation. But I think when we talk about this idea of rape culture, and hopefully you brothers can see it, right? We see that it stems from, again, a lot of societal conditioning, right? So when we talk about sexist attitudes, when we talk about rape jokes, when we talk about locker room banter, just this idea of things that's been normalized, right? Things that's been normalized and how that permeates our thinking. And when it comes to, again, how we see the world, I don't want to make it specific for, again, this is endemic to those who identify as hetero cis males, right? Or this goes to those who of differing identities, those of differing sexualities, and I think that's a great time to come to you, Zane, because I do would like to understand just your perspective in general when it comes to the societal conditioning that's impacted, again, how those who identify as male see the world. I saw somebody say, no, I actually read it, and it was just like, listen, we've all grown up in rape culture, right? And so it's difficult for us to now change the dial for a lot of us. So if you could speak to that.
I mean, so even before you decide who you want to be with, or well, let me speak specifically and personally. Even before I decided who or gave in to who I was attracted to sexually, I was still around men who were mostly heterosexual. Like I had the good fortune of growing up with two fathers. I had a stepfather and I had a father who were both in my life at the same time. And I remember looking back and seeing how I would repeat certain phrases like "come here, woman," or these kind of things that were definitely, misogynistic at worst, or insensitive at best. You know what I mean? So you pick up and you learn what's in your environment. And I think when it came to sexuality or consent or rape and that kind of thing, it was a dominance that you felt that men had over women or tried to have over women, because a lot of women weren't having that, at least at least in their energy. And I think you grow up thinking that you have this dominance over women, not even consciously. And so the being gay, that didn't I didn't really start to realize how I expressed that dominance until I was in teaching situations, or I was in situations where I could feel I wasn't honoring a woman for her fullness. So in my space, I recognize that feeling of privilege or dominance that I had, and I had to start to roll that back and just sort of identify it. Like with my sister or with people that I worked with. Recently, I had to check myself in terms of favoritism with two colleagues. I was like, I love men, so I always have to make sure I'm not favoring men just because I love men. You know what I mean? And to check myself, was I dominating this woman or pushing her out? I wanted to be fair, but it's a sense of dominance, um, a sense that we have a right to dominate you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we've been given this right, and you have to first recognize it, because it's hard to recognize, because it's so um,
Practice.
it's so practiced, and it's not invisible, but it's accepted in a way that you don't realize that it's there. Like you watch two people argue and then you think that they're equal until the physical part comes into play. Like I can remember not my real father, but I can remember my father was a very soft-spoken man. He didn't argue. He would leave the room before he'd argue. But I remember my stepfather and my mom argued, and it wasn't until not that he got physical, but I remember he punched a wall one time. So that was a show of force that I took on and didn't realize I took that on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely appreciate that response. I want to go to you, Mike, and just get your thoughts on just this whole idea, because you did message me say, "Yo, I listened to the
Yeah.
podcast, and I had some thoughts on it." So just your ideas, and your thoughts related to the topic of rape culture. How men are conditioned, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just like I did check out the podcast, and like you, there were moments where I was like, yeah, like they're close to getting to something that could be used, but they're also like kind of on the line of still being really supportive of it, or almost like hand waving at it, not really talking about it fully. But then I had to also, like you, think about like, well, where are they at in their process? Because there is something like cancel culture that plays into this, and balancing that while we're also talking about something as serious as rape culture, because it is like Zane just hit on, it is somewhat insidious, right? Because it's so built into our societal scripts that we tell ourselves, and kind of like what's already been echoed here is there's like this expectation of deservedness. Like I deserve that woman, and therefore I have an expectation that I'm going to get her. And it's like taught to us from like look at like little kids that are like 2-year-olds and they got a ladies man shirt on, right? It's like little subtle
That conditioning,
messaging.
yeah.
Yeah, it's all over our society, and we have to. The one thing that let me down with that podcast is they kept saying, if it's my friend, I'll say something. Like there had to be an established relationship for them to call somebody out. When it's the bigger problem is, what are you signal boosting as a man in the world? Like, are you giving off solutions? are you giving off actions? Are you giving off the right words that show someone that they can't treat women with this expectation that they deserve them? Like, it's not just about who my friend is. I need to be putting off the energy that says, I understand that I come from a point of privilege as a man in a patriarchal society, and I need to recognize that I need to like work against that and use my privilege for power, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, that's why I appreciate you bringing men together to discuss this, because we do need to do that.
For sure. For sure. And last but not least, Dr. Charles, love to get your perspective on the topic at hand.
So, bro, this is an interesting topic to hear you all speak, because I feel like we're still missing the point, because we are talking about rape culture just when it comes to heterosexuality, men raping women, and the rape culture. And we know that rape exists across the spectrum, and men are the lion's share of violence towards people. And so I don't want us to miss out on that point when it comes to that. We've normalized as Zane said, is we have normalized the dominance of men, but I don't want to leave out other populations that men dominate. And so that's my take. I didn't get a chance to really listen to the entire podcast.
Yeah.
But I love what Michael said is that they kept harping on, if this is my friend, you know, and in my growth as both a scholar and a practitioner and as a personal man, we see it play out. And how do we hold ourselves accountable for our own actions? As Michael said, when it comes to our privilege as a man, how do we step forward and not have, as we talk about the bystander effect, and make sure that we're not standing on the sidelines when things happen? Because, as you said, Phil, we are evolving. We're hoping that we're evolving people. We're evolving, right, humans. And so if we begin to continue to dehumanize people, right, all we're doing is just advocating for rape culture to continue to exist, because we're allowing for the dehumanization to exist. And so I don't want to miss out on this point where we're just sitting talking about men raping women. And so I don't want that, everybody watching, that this is a conversation that should be about everybody that's involved in this process.
Listen, I completely agree, Dr. Charles. Actually, I was going to get to that. I didn't know if you were going to touch on it or not, but everybody that knows me, and I talked about it with that rape culture diagram, a phenomenal diagram that it is. I feel that, again, we were looking at it from a perspective that this is endemic to hetero-cis men, right? And so when we talk about survivors come in different identities, right? And so with that, what I found lacking in a lot of the literature and the information and the resources that I found, even though I understand what statistically what it looks like, right? But it never talks. Rarely does it talk from men in a from a survivor's perspective, right? And so that's why I think it's important to have people like Tyrone on, who identifies as a survivor, that we do have this perspective. Again, it's men quote unquote perpetrating against women. It's men perpetrating against other men. It's women perpetrating against men and boys. And I think that it's critical that we recognize that in this conversation that we're all involved in this, right? And it's not, even though we understand that where the majority of the offenses and a lot of the inappropriate behaviors that we talk about, the normalization and the degradation of people, especially when it gets to the assault phase, we know that it's primarily men and women. And so with that, it had me thinking of just about this idea of just the normalization piece. And I know Mike talked about it when you were talking about a child with the ladies' man shirt, and how just the imagery and so many that comes from so many different avenues. And I just think for me, I just try to think back, like, when did I begin to learn that this is what the world was, right? Well, from a patriarchal perspective. And for me, I always attributed to hip hop, right? And I understand the influence that patriarchy has had on hip hop, and then the misogyny and the misandry that comes with that. But for me, it played a big influence in my life. It influenced how I saw other men. It influenced how I saw other how I saw women, and it took me a while to come to that realization, even though I found myself identifying as somebody who I knew listening to Too Short, it was something wrong about it. Right? Lupe Fiasco, he raps about, I heard Jay-Z use the word B, right? Say the B word, bitch. I guess, I get scared about saying it. It say that, but then you step back and it was just like, no, it's something wrong about that. But not having the courage or the understanding or the wherewithal to really step up and say, you know what, this is wrong. It really took me until my 30s to really get into this, to become comfortable with self, to where I can say, nah, that's not a good look. Right. When we talk about just the normalization and unlearning so much that I've learned, and I'd be interested to learn about you guys as influences that really has shaped you, right? Not because, again, we could speak out and talk about other men and what we see and hypotheticals, but more importantly, I'm interested in hearing about you and what shaped how you see the world as those who identify as men.
I'll jump in on this, and I'll share a personal story that I think helps to illustrate, the type of conditioning that we're succumbed to. So, as a young man, I was sexually abused by a family member, a woman. And when you think about young men who are molested versus young women that are molested, usually when a young man is molested, it's celebrated like, almost like, again, like a rite of passage. You made it, now you're a man, type of thing. And so in some ways, think about the messages that sends to these young men, about sex and about physicality and about the ways that, and about his body really, and how he uses his body. I think that's fundamentally, one thing that has shaped me in the ways that I move about the world, and just being extra sensitive when it comes to, I'm not going to say that I always specifically and explicitly ask for consent, but I've always been aware of my role and kind of the ways that I interact with women, or just whether I'm romantically linked or not, just the ways that I interact with women. So I think that for me was a foundational experience. But then, moving forward, when it comes to, I think you both alluded to this, Charles and Phil, about holding yourself and others accountable. For me, it really is fundamentally about what are you willing to risk, right? If you really want to move beyond the conversation on a kind of broad level and really start to attack action items and action behaviors, then yeah, what are you willing to risk? Because I think about men who have talked to me about seeing something taking place in the street corner and being afraid for their own safety and not speaking up because of that. So how do we reconcile that versus doing the right thing just because it's the right thing? Whether or not it's sacrificing our safety, sacrificing our relationships, etc. I think that's the level of questioning that we have to have for ourselves and others to really move the needle, in my opinion.
Yeah, Jason, I totally agree with that. There's a cachet that you have to actually like critically think about as you begin to address this. And people like Phil, who have this platform, have the privilege to, address that. But in everyday life, that moment to moment cachet that you have to think about, what am I going to give up potentially, or what am I going to gain in this cachet for this? Is that thought process. Do I call my boy out? Do I call that dude out, right, in front of his people, and what happens? And then, I could be a hero. Everybody's thinking like, hey, I should have done this, or,
or a victim,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Zane.
So I'm trying to. I was listening to what Charles said, and I was listening to what Jason said, and I'm just thinking about sex in general and how that space is such a taboo space in America, and that a lot of things that happen in secret are related to rape and that kind of thing. And so even in the gay culture, and that's what I was trying to think of, I directed my answer toward a certain type of way of being that I felt like I've adapted, even in the gay culture, right? Of being a dominant person, and what that means when it comes to sex. And then I heard Jason tell his story, and I'm thinking that's the same in the gay culture because it's a rite of passage to have sex with an older person. You know what I mean? You never think of it as rape, right? And it changes the way we understand things. Even if you don't know that immediately, and even if you don't identify it until you're older, it changes the way you think about relationships and boundaries. You know what I mean? Because once the boundaries become blurred, it's difficult later in life not to know that they're not there, but it's easier to blur those boundaries again, right? To cross those boundaries because they've been crossed by you, and it's celebrated in a way, especially when you're a male having sex with an older person.
Yeah, and I definitely agree 100% with what he just said. I myself, I experienced sexual molestation for about 10 years from an older female cousin, and I also experienced being inappropriately touched by a male teacher. No penetration, but a touch is a bad touch is a touch. But ironically, in the midst of having that 10-year relationship with that older cousin, one of the things when I think back and I reflect, she wasn't the only one. So, I didn't realize for years that although I blamed myself for being a womanizer, for taking advantage of women, and I've never really had to work for women. I've always gotten attention. So it was just there for me. But it wasn't until my old therapist, who's like a big sister to me, R.G. Allen, said to me, stop blaming yourself. Did it ever occur to you that you also were being taken advantage of? You've had women throw themselves at you or position themselves in places where they could take advantage of you because you were always vulnerable, because you had no boundaries, which I did not. I didn't know how to protect myself. I didn't even know, I knew how to say no to the ones that I wasn't attracted to, but I didn't know how to say no when I really didn't want to do it. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I would have sex with a woman, and then immediately after the act was over, I would go jump in the shower and try to wash the shame away. And who could I talk to about? Because, it was like, wow, I really didn't want this happen, but I had no self-control. I had no boundaries. Clearly, I didn't have self-esteem, but I also didn't have respect for myself. And I realized as I proceeded and got older, I also didn't respect women, but that had a lot to do with the trauma. And you don't always have to rape someone to hurt them. I didn't know how to respect women, and that was largely due to my own trauma because I didn't have respect for myself, nor did I have the foundation. So I used the culture of taking advantage of vulnerable women who I would get them before they get me. You get what I'm saying? You learn that behavior as a coping mechanism.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
I think the idea, everybody kind of hit on the idea of boundaries so far. And I think that's key because when I reflect back on how I was brought up, right? I was brought up by a single dad who had 2 sons, right? Hardly ever home because he was working to support us. We taught ourselves, right? That means I'm learning from my friends. That means I'm learning from media. So I'm learning from TV, movies, whatever. And we're not teaching kids consent and boundaries.
Right.
Listen, that's not just for girls, that's for little boys too. They need to know what body autonomy is. They need to know what consent is, because we have these, it's kind of like we were talking about last week when we ascribe ideas to either masculine or feminine traits, but just because we think boys are rough and tumble, they'll handle themselves. Nah, man, they need a conversation about what their body is, what consent is.
Yeah.
And it's about having conversations that are uncomfortable. Like Jason was talking about, like, what am I willing to sacrifice in this moment for an uncomfortable conversation? And bringing it back to what Dr. Charles said, I think it's like, we don't always have to do a call out, but we do need a come to, like a conversation, like a moment where I approach another human being and just say, like, listen, I saw what just happened. I was wondering if you'd like to have a conversation about it. Because I think sometimes we go right into like pitchforks and torches, and we want to drag someone through the streets. And I think sometimes we need to like balance that, but it's really about education for me. Like we gotta educate kids younger about what autonomy and consent looks like.
Word. Let me post this comment. Zakia Waller says, "Sex and boundaries, because we fear speaking about sex as a society. We continue to not understand the boundaries or discuss them." Definitely agree. I know you had your hand up, Zane. You wanted to comment?
No, I was just going to say that. I mean, what we teach is not nuanced. I mean, if you learn anything from a Judeo-Christian perspective, is don't do it until you're married, right? And don't sit on somebody's lap, and don't go into so-and-so's house, and these kind of things. So you're learning boundaries, but there's no nuance to those boundaries, and it only creates mystery by the way we have the conversation about it. Because I remember my grandmother and family members, correcting sexual behavior, but in a way that was so awkward and so bizarre that you walked away being more confused about the correction than anything.
Yeah.
Like I remember I used the word virgin before, and the answer, the solution that my aunt and uncle gave was to send my cousin and myself out on the porch. And this is what my cousin said to me. So, virgin like the Virgin Mary. I was like, yeah. And that was the end of the conversation. I was still confused, and I can't remember right now how that came up. You know what I mean? Whether they overheard me use the word virgin, but they were so scared to have a real discussion, a nuanced discussion about boundaries and sexuality and body, that it was just don't do it. And if it came up, the conversation was so confusing that.
But can I add
that
something
you
to
felt
that?
even more anxiety around?
Real quick. No, and it just goes to Zane's point. Just especially when we talk about our older generation. I was at a mental health symposium that was had here maybe about 2 to 3 years ago, held by former state senator Vincent Hughes, and we were talking about mental health. A sex therapist stood up, and she was having a conversation about the importance of sex to our mental health. And it was just like all the old church ladies started clutching their pearls, right? And so it was this idea that, and you can tell they were so uncomfortable with the conversation that it would lead one to believe that they didn't view themselves as sexual beings, right? They viewed themselves as, I hate to say concubines but they're supposed to be there at their husband's whim, right? And that was and I started listening to some of the chatter, and that's what I was hearing. And so to Zane's point, yeah, a lot of our older generation, that was something that was definitely uncomfortable for them. And so here it is, me being 36. I don't ever think I learned about sex from my parents. I learned about it from my friends. I learned about it from watching porn. I learned about it from Red Shoe Diaries at midnight. But everything except from the I said midnight.
I about that show. Showtime.
I learned about it from every other place except from the person who loves me the most, which is my mother. And so even me having a conversation with my daughter, I do have a stepson, my son, but I didn't have the conversation with him because I just found it to be extremely awkward, extremely uncomfortable. And so we continue to pass these things along, but also what we're passing along is, again, this normalized behavior when it comes to sex, right? Go ahead, Tyrone.
So, so one of the things that I think gets left out of the conversation when we're talking about consent and boundaries, especially when we're talking to our kids, we sometimes forget to tell our kids that includes them having boundaries even with us as parents or other family members. Because I feel like what's get left out when we're having these conversations, we're always talking to them about boundaries as it relates to sometimes strangers, maybe people we don't know. But a lot of times the abuse comes from people we know, and we don't know how to protect ourselves to the people who have the most access to us. So you get what I'm saying? So, like with my grands, I always tell my grands, nobody has to play with you. You have to give people their space to say yes or no. I want to play with you, or I don't want to play with you now, or set boundaries. You can set boundaries even with your siblings. So I feel like, when we're educating our kids, we have to educate them in a way that they even know how to protect themselves with family members, because I think that's who we're most vulnerable to, because we sometimes still stuck on that stranger danger thing.
Yeah.
And so
Facts.
so the people that really have access to us are the people who are in close proximity with us every day. So I feel like there's a lot of ways we can have this conversation, but we also have to prep them and include ourselves in the conversation and say, hey, even if you don't feel like getting a kiss from daddy or grandpa, tell me, I don't feel like that. And I have to respect, because I think you're teaching them boundaries and consent. You're giving them permission to make a decision for themselves that I believe could help them protect themselves in the future.
Yeah, I want to get to this next question, and Jason, I'm gonna start with you because Zane talked about about the idea of consent in particular being so nuanced, and Tyrone hit on that as well. Do you think consent is as black and white as it's often portrayed? And just a little background again, I was been doing research, and I've had this conversation at the men's group, and I was looking today at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which is a state college here in Pennsylvania, and I was looking at their website and some information that they were sending about the idea of consent, and it was just like you have to get a yes, right, in every situation, and I was just like, I was taken aback, right? I understand the premise behind it. I understand what their intent is, or maybe I don't, right? But again, so many situations are nuanced. I think for them, it's the idea of, listen, we don't want any issues. We don't want the school being in the news for any reason, right? So listen, we're going to make it as plain as this. It's black or white. If you don't get a yes in any situation, then don't do it. And so I want to ask you, again, is consent as black and white as many make it out to be?
Yeah, I'm glad that you got here because I was actually going to bring up the fact that context is important as it relates to this conversation. So, I was watching this. It's funny. I was watching this stand-up comedian, Paul Burr, and he was making a joke about consent and this exact topic. And he was saying that same scenario, it just depends on who's viewing that scenario. But the scenario was, you're on a date and, you're approaching, you're maybe making your move, as they say, you're making that first move. And the woman gives you kind of this coy no that you read as her initial kind of what she needs to do to protect herself, right? Check the box, but it's still an invitation for you to continue the advance. He's like, look, if you get a bad read in court, that's the end of you, right? Because it depends on the context, right? And I think that's the important part, is that we've been taught that that initial no is actually an invitation for a yes down the line. And so you are to proceed past that. I don't think it's black and white. I think that it does depend on, another example, if you're at work, I think men, one thing that we don't give ourselves enough credit for is that we do know right and wrong, and we do have intuition. It's just that we don't pay attention to that intuition. We kind of just bulldoze over it. But when you're in an environment, you're talking to a woman or you're talking to someone who you might have dominance over, when what's too far, what line there is, and when you're getting close to that line. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to be mindful of that, but it also is important to just have a conversation if there is some doubt. And I think that's where that's where you can eliminate some of the gray area, is that if you are in conversation and you might be a little bit unsure, you don't know what the feeling is in that dynamic, then ask a question. Is this feel good for you, right? Is this, are you vibing with this right now? And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a mood killer, but there's a way that you can learn to ask questions in a way that doesn't make it awkward, but still gets you the clarity that you both deserve in that dynamic.
Word. Dr. Charles, what about you? Do you think consent is as black and white as society tends to make it out to be?
Yeah, I do. And Jason, I appreciate the answer. I think in the culture that we live in, I think in our everyday instances, consent is everything. Regardless whether it's about sex or whether it's about a conversation, it's about a compliment that you're going to give to a person. Consent is black and white. because at the end of the day, I feel like we've talked about this from the male's perspective, or the person, like we've got to protect that person, right? Or that person has to be protected. No, we've got to stop people from taking liberties against people, right, without having consent. And I think we miss that point, right? I don't, what happens. I work with some super dope women where I work, right? They're also super attractive, right? So if I want to say like, hey, you've got on a nice dress on today, I first ask them like, can I give you a compliment? Right? Because that signals to them like I still am retaining my power. Like you saying, oh, you look great in that dress, I've taken away their power. And I never want to do that. But that's the evolution of me as a man, right? Because I would normally, right, as a younger man, you look really good. You look hot in those jeans or whatever. And not knowing that makes, like, I don't want to hear that. And to have so many women out there saying, or so many people out there saying, like, I don't really want to hear that. That's not what this is about. And so I, in my opinion, think consent is black and white. You have to achieve consent before you move forward. That's it. That's my perspective, though.
So let me ask you this. So what are there areas in our life where we don't necessarily seek consent, right? I think we're looking at it from a macro perspective when we talk about sexually engaging with another person or touching somebody potentially in a sexual way or an intimate way. But even when we look at things at a micro level, when we talk about when we see somebody and giving them a hug, right, or a handshake or various things, all of these things are things where we don't necessarily seek consent. But it's where there's assumptions made and where it's just implied, right? Because that's just the norm of society. So what are your thoughts on that? Should we be asking for consent in every arena? Hey, is it cool if I shake your hand? Hey, have we seen Joe Biden get in trouble for putting his arm on? Well, he went a little further, like caressing hair, right? But putting your hand on somebody's shoulder to console them. I know me personally, with regards to the latter and putting my hand on somebody's shoulder, I've been more cognizant of that, right? To say, hey, is it okay for me to put my hand on your shoulder, especially if you're in a mood, which, a sad mood or, or what have you, not if you're happy, but even still in a happy mood, should we still be asking somebody in day-to-day situations such as those?
I mean, that's a good question, brother. And I think, the handshake is a universal thing that we go without consent, right? You're asking for consent when you put your hand out and somebody then puts their hand back to you. They've given you consent. But I think if you don't know someone and you go up to hug them, right, that's still in my opinion, that's still taking away their power, right? Their ability to say, you know what, I don't know you. You potentially are a threat. Why are you without consent wanting to hug me or put your hands on me or put your arms around me? And so to me, again, it goes back to initially, right? You're asking for consent. Like, I understand that you might have had a bad day. Is it okay for me to give you a hug? Because that allows them to have power. And I don't ever want to take away anyone's power.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate because I think Jason and Dr. Charles both have a point, right? And I think it's where, like, the context of relationships, before we have information, before we have knowledge of this person, consent is black and white. It is. You haven't found out about who they are. You need to get to know them. You need to figure out what they appreciate and what they don't appreciate, what makes them uncomfortable, what doesn't make them uncomfortable. But I think, like, when you've established a relationship, you do have to do a little bit more nuanced work, because you do have to recognize certain tells. Because listen, consent isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's nonverbal. Anyone that's been in a long relationship knows that there's nonverbal cues you got to pick up on at times. And then I wanted to throw in there one thing that we haven't really talked about yet, is that when we talk about consent, it's still so the act of sex focused. And I'm not even just talking about, penetration. That is, like, when we talk about consent, people have in their head this idea of, like, penetration, right? And part of it is that our conversations on sex are so steeped in heteronormativity that that's what it's seen as. It's seen as like insertion, right? That's sex. And one thing that we don't see in heterosexual relationships as much as you'll see in either like homosexual relationships, where there's more navigating, right? You have to have some communication before you have sex with something. Like you have to figure out like what's like, are they a top or are they a bottom, right? There's more navigating involved. Like as a bi man, like meeting up with men, there was way more conversation ahead of time. Whereas with meeting up with women, it was more like, okay, well, it's only going to go this way.
Yeah.
So there's something wrong there, but we have to add nuance to that conversation.
Listen, we're going to continue this conversation with consent, but I know I'm about to call you Dr. Rosario. Well, forget it. We're going to call you Dr. Rosario anyway. I know you got to get ready to go. So I just want to get your last thoughts when it comes to, and we're going to continue the conversation on consent for sure, but just get your thoughts on just this idea of accountability and allyship and what that looks like.
In what context, though?
Just as far as when it comes to this idea of holding one another accountable, when we talk about brothers, our friends, it could be strangers, and then the idea of allyship when it talks about those, when we're talking about survivors or those who are being perpetrated against.
Yeah. Well, I think as it relates to accountability, I think it's something that I said earlier. It's really just about questioning how much you're willing to sacrifice or gain. I don't think it's a zero-sum game, but I do think it requires a level of stepping outside of your own interest in order to do the right thing. And that means if you're trying to be accountable to yourself, making sure that you're policing yourself in that way, but also friends and people that you might observe doing things that are questionable. That accountability is stepping up to the plate, even if it feels uncomfortable. And then as far as allyship goes, I think it's something that we've always talked about, Phil, is, allyship is not something that you self-anoint. It's something that you've got to demonstrate through a track record. What kind of track record do you have that demonstrates your allyship in action? Show me instances in which you have taken action on behalf of an underrepresented group or someone who is marginalized. And I think that, to me, as it relates to rape culture, it goes hand in hand with accountability, right? If you are, and I didn't get a chance to finish listening to the podcast, but what we're all talking about here is exactly that, is how do we become more accountable to ourselves and to each other? And then also, how do we become allies to ourselves and to each other? And then to, in the case of heteronormative relationships, women, right? And so how do we make sure we call each other out when we see each other stepping out of line? So to me, those two concepts go hand in hand.
Listen, appreciate you, brother. Follow him on Instagram at Jason_Rosario. Peace, brother.
Thank you, guys.
Good one. Thanks, Jason.
Take care.
So we're gonna go to you, Zane.
Yeah.
Before you, I'm not sure how much of it you got to hear because I know you got disconnected. But just, is consent as black and white as it's portrayed in society?
No, again, I think that you have to think about context, right? And so there's what Michael said is so true, and I think that's how there's so many things that are running through my head in terms of gay culture and consent. So you're on a date, you know what I mean? What's the context? If somebody's body language is saying no, like Jason said, and like Dr. Charles was saying, we're not taught to say no. But in the gay culture, you negotiate a lot of things. And I was thinking about being at a sex party and how even just a step away, you know what I mean? You step away from someone and that means no. And that those things are understood in those spaces, that even the smallest form of physical no means no. You know what I mean? That in those spaces, you would think that they might be more open to rape, but the subtlety of nuance, things, they're no. So yeah, so even the smallest thing can be misunderstood in those situations. But going back to the question, which I think I strayed away from, is it black and white? No, it's not black and white. But sometimes, yes, it is black and white.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
it's definitely situational.
Like, I read Casey Lemon's book and how they used to pull trains. Was that consensual, really? You know what I mean? A lot of the train pulling culture in our society and the way we grow up, that's not really consensual. And the other thing that I wrote down while we were talking, like a lot of things are transactional. You know what I mean? Like men feel like sex is transactional. So if you walk into a situation feeling something is transactional, you're not looking for boundaries. You're looking to get what you think you put in, right? So your whole mindset is wrong. So how do you create a nuanced situation when for him it's black and white? Because it's like, I pay for dinner, we're going to have sex. So
Yeah.
that's the black and white part. Everything else on the person, whether it's a male or female, who's the victim, so to speak, or who's the person who has to give the consent. You know what I mean? That's where the nuance comes. You know what I mean? That's where a reluctance is a no. You know what I mean? So I wanted to go on more about that transactional thing, because I think
Yeah,
even in
I'm gonna let you get
situations
to
of
that because
incest,
matter of fact, go ahead,
okay.
get that point off because it might be something Tyrone want to respond to.
No, I was saying even in situations as a child, and I've made mistakes in my life, and I've held myself accountable for those things and been through the fire and come out on the other side. And I think that what I learned is, like, a lot of things is misunderstood love, right? So even when you think that love is transactional, some weird way we learn that sex is love, and that's something that gets confused from a very young age,
Yeah, I want to comment on
and that
something
that hurts. Yeah.
because I do see see we have actually a lot of comments popping off. I'm not sure if y'all are able to see them or not. Let's see. So Afia said, she said consent is not black and white when drugs and alcohol are involved for any gender. Ignoring those very common circumstances is negligent and dangerous. For sure. Let me see. The Kalima Johnson, the Yusuf called women and girls females. And see, I appreciate that comment, Kalima, for sure. And I appreciate you tuning in. But I think this is the exact reason why, right? Where I decided once I started the hashtag You Good Man Men's group, because I feel like that's a conversation for another time, and sometimes it gets lost. And so, if you don't have brothers who aren't as aware, who aren't as evolved, granted, we might not be using the language that one may desire, right? We might not be using the vogue language of today, but yet we're still trying to learn. We're still trying to understand the best that we can. And so, I'm not going to call it minutia, but I don't want the focus to be put on the language of somebody using the term female, right? But I would rather the focus be, and it's necessary because that could shame somebody from even continuing to converse and to have a conversation. And so I think it's important that we recognize that when it comes to conversations with men about topics that they're still trying to understand. And so, and this is no shade to you at all, but again, I think, and I know this goes to that point, Charles, that I wanted to have when it comes to why it might be particularly for men, right? This conversation, because I don't want to get lost and have other conversations come in. But no, I definitely appreciate you for tuning in. Let me see. So we have Keisha Danae Watley. In a patriarchal society, the idea of asking for consent almost smacks men in the face as an indication of submission, that they don't own everything and have dominance. How can men heal their need to dominate and see others as equal in asking for consent? Feel free to comment on those comments if you choose, but we definitely gonna get to you, Tyrone, and get your thoughts on the
No, it's
idea
okay.
of. No, go ahead. You could definitely give your yeah.
No, I do think in most cases it's black and white. I think the gray area is a gray area where there's a misunderstanding or there's no communication. You get what I'm saying? So I think when we're being honest, people in relationships, we're afraid to ask certain questions, and that's where the misunderstanding comes in at, or there's a gray area being meaning, someone mentioned it earlier, you can't consent to sex if you're drunk, you can't consent to sex under the influence of drugs, you can't consent to sex if you're asleep, those are gray areas. But in most cases, the majority of things are black and white. Yes means yes, and no means no. There's a thing called body language. If somebody seems uncomfortable, that's a no. Nobody has to say it. if you're in touch or in tune, read their body language. I can clearly see when somebody's uncomfortable. Ask them, are they okay? Are you okay with moving forward? If not, let me know. So it's about us being honest with ourselves. I think in most cases, our selfish desires come into play. So we're not concerned about the other person. We're trying to meet a need. And that's just not always men on women. That works both ways because we're entitled. We see each other as objects, especially when our flesh is flaming. We have to be honest about those things. So there are some nuances. There are some gray areas. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in and chime in maybe on some of the comments that they've read? You going silent?
Oh
no,
no,
go
you
ahead.
gotta read it back to me. Yeah, I read it back to me.
I think the one about intoxication is important. You know what I mean? Because again, that's about context, right? And I think what Tyrone is saying is that for the majority of people who are tone deaf in terms of body language, or not even tone deaf, that's not the right word, who are so programmed to think that they deserve what's in front of them and they get what they want, they are ignoring the sign. So in those instances, and I think we have to be very specific about who, because in a general way, things are black and white. And in a general way, things are not black and white, right?
Yeah, in a utopia,
that's
in a perfect
contradiction.
world.
What I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to get at is, in situations where you feel resistance and you just bulldoze that, you know that you did something wrong, but you feel entitled to take it. Now, a lot of us don't operate in those spaces anymore, right? We don't operate in those spaces, but a lot of people do, and I think that's where we get in trouble, is where you let your privilege and your expectation of what you're supposed to get in a transactional world. We live in a capitalist world, and sex is transactional. We believe everything is transactional, and that maybe we don't believe it, but it's in our mind. So you know what I mean? I'm babbling now, but I'll stop.
No. It makes complete sense. I think when we talk about intimate relationships in particular, I think about dates, right? I think about me going on a date with a woman and me not attempting to kiss her because I was too shy. And then after several dates, it's like, yo, what took you so long, right, for me to initiate it? So again, that idea of consent, do I ask and say, hey, am I allowed to kiss you? Again, we miss this, how it's practiced, right? We take out the human element. There's so many things that when we say that it is black and white that we don't account for, right? But and I think this goes to the point of it being nuanced. Again, when we add liquor or drugs into the equation, that definitely changes it. I can only speak to the liquor aspect. Especially that one time I smoked marijuana. Hi, Mom, if you're listening. But when we talk about alcohol, I might go out with somebody. I might have a drink to take the edge off, and they might have drink or multiple drinks. Again, technically, can either one of us consent? And I was reading some good information. I forget what university that was from, but it was just like, listen, if you have any concern or confusion when it comes to consent when alcohol is involved, especially when we talk about hetero-cis relationships, right? Think about who typically the courts favor if we're being honest in situations like this, right? Think about it. If wake up and somebody, hey, no, this wasn't supposed to happen, whoever is the initiator of it, there's a high probability that they'll be the one prosecuted. And so it was just like, but again, are we thinking about that in our day to day if we're trying to court somebody? If again, it's so nuanced. Yes, as we said in child welfare, you always want to err on the side of caution. Go ahead, Zane, because it looks like your mouth is blown up.
Well, I'm struggling with the word nuance
Yeah, me
in the
too. Me
in the
too.
way we see what has transpired, right? It's not nuanced for somebody to grab somebody's titty. That's wrong, right?
No,
You know, you got
and I
somebody
think that's
grab.
when we talk about the macros and the black and whites, the non-negotiables, like
Right.
rape.
Okay, so that's the
No,
word.
that's
That's the
not
word.
nuanced. Touching somebody
Yeah.
against their will. No, but if you're on a date, and I'm not too well versed on the Aziz Ansari situation, right? Clearly, two perceptions of what happened when it comes to their date or what have you. And we see this on dates a lot of times, right? Where somebody might have differing perspectives, especially the ones that make the news when it comes to celebrities. But yeah, that's where the nuance comes in. False. The average situation, there will be no arrest or charges. The courts and law enforcement favors the man. Again, we can. I don't necessarily know if that's true, Amari.
Well, it has
Right?
been.
Say it again.
I mean, if you thinking about what the past was like,
Well,
you know what I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. If we think about what the past is like,
and
for
how we
sure.
got here, you know what I
Yeah,
mean, how we got here.
yeah, yeah. So,
I
man,
mean, there is some truth with regard to a lot of these cases not being, a lot of these cases, men aren't always convicted.
oh
So
no,
it,
for sure.
so that's a nuance, if you will. It's unfortunate, but again, I feel like the gray area comes down to conversation, and
Right.
then asking certain questions up front. I feel, and I know it to be very true because when I have conversations with my female friends, I notice it more with my female friends than my male friends. Uh, they're uncomfortable to have certain conversations because they want somebody to like them. You get what I'm saying? And my thing is, give me, if I'm asking you something, I want you to give me the answer that I'm asking, because what I don't want to happen is I don't want to misread you. I don't want you to take my choice away. So I'm asking for a reason. So I think when you have a conversation, it doesn't allow much room for a gray area.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? You
yeah,
have to dive into what are your what are your turn offs? What does that entail? Like, what are your turn offs? Because you'll find a lot. Like there, I think I'm a happy go lucky person in most cases. But just because I'm a man doesn't mean I always like to be touched. There are times I don't want somebody in my space. I don't want you touching me. I don't want you hugging me. And you know what I'm saying? Where we have this notion that, hey, most men like that attention. No, I don't like the attention. I've had attention my whole life. I'm not always looking for attention. I don't want you to touch me, and I don't want you in my space. So I think a lot of times we have to have these conversations so we know where we stand with the person that we're engaging with.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think we also
Go ahead,
need
Dr. Charles.
Tyrone. So thank you for all of that. I think the addition that I would make to that is that if a person is not, consent still even goes into that person being ready to have that conversation.
That's true too.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I
and
can, yeah.
so that's
And
all I
that was
would.
my question. So how do we get to the point where we can have a conversation? What does that initiate look like? What do we have to become to be able to say something? Like, what's that transformation like? That's my question. Because yes, we know it can be black and white, right? And yes,
Mhm.
we know it can be nuanced. For instance, if I'm flirting with a man that I don't know if he's gay or not, and the first flirt that I throw at him, I think it goes over his head, or he responds, is that consent? You understand what I mean? Is that consent for me to flirt more?
Yeah, yeah. I
You
I
understand?
mean,
So
it's
those things are nuanced. But then when you really get to where somebody, now in certain situations, if I'm flirting with Phil's about 100 pounds more than me, maybe a little less. If I say something wrong to Phil, I might get hurt. You understand what I mean? So, but I'm the one making the advance. So
yeah,
where is the nuance there? Like, what kind of antenna do I have to have up? And I know I have the antenna up all the time, but I'm saying somebody else, if it's a male female relationship, you don't even have no antenna up because you just flirting. You throwing your best shots. You throwing your best shots. You don't have no perception that you might get hurt.
yeah,
But
yeah.
are you reading their body language? Because I
Yeah,
feel like
Yeah,
body language speaks volumes to me. Like if somebody's flirting with me, I'm not flirting back. I'm saying something when I'm not saying absolutely anything.
Yeah,
And
I
it's just
agree.
But that's the
again,
answer. That's the answer to my question, though. Like, how do we? How do we learn that? You have to start paying attention. Other men
So
have to start paying attention to more than what they think they deserve
yeah,
or what they want in
absolutely,
the
I agree.
moment.
and I
I
hate to
agree.
make this an all lives matter moment, but no, we all do. We all need to
Yeah.
to be paying attention to what body language is saying.
Absolutely.
I know me personally. There's been times where, again, I'm not going to make it seem like it happens all the time, but I've definitely been physically accosted. I've had, especially when I had some muscles, right? I've had I've had comments made about me that were uncomfortable, and
Hmm.
and various things that take place, and I don't want to minimize men when we're the ones being the individual who's
You're
looked
on trial.
upon in this way, right? Because again, the conversation, and it tends to be one-sided, and I don't want to lose sight of that. I think body language is an important thing. When I've worked with children as a therapist, and understanding body language, it's a difficult, arduous process in having them understand. But with that, what happens is it typically takes a lot of interactions, right? It
Hmm.
takes a lot of interactions. It takes a lot of life experience. But if we think about, we're not really socialized to learn how to interact with one another from an early age, right? When we think about the classroom setting, I think about the calls that I get from my daughter's school from time to time, and her engaging with kids within in the classroom setting. And so they're not typically trying to teach things such as proximity, right? What that looks like, eye contact, what that looks like, what resistance looks like, right? What somebody, what folded arms might look like, and how that's
Hmm.
a measure of resistance. We typically are left up to our own devices to learn, and those who have a desire just for knowledge in itself and understanding and awareness, and again, it comes from a lot of interactions with people. We tend to be ones to seek that out, but even with that, we still get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
For me, I'm super aware, I'm hyper aware, right? Because I don't want to put myself in situations. And again, I think these extremes, that where we are now, you hope that at some point that the shift, that's taken place since the Me Too movement, that there was an extreme that was necessary to say, yo, this shit is fucked up, right? And so you need to be mindful of everything that you do. But with everything, you hope that this extreme starts to come back, and we start to say, okay, that we were offered a little bit more grace, right? When it comes to situations like this. I want to see what Victor has to say. You have to want enthusiastic consent the same way you want the physical connection. Also, body language is not a good practice, because how people recognize body language, culture, and bias dictates how folks view them. Also, what about those with autism? Again, it's a tool, right? I don't think we're necessarily saying that it's the end all be all, but body language is definitely a tool when we talk about the idea of consent. You might have just tuned in, Victor, but and I don't mean to call you Victor like I'm your pop, but but we were talking about the idea of consent when it comes to handshakes, when it comes to hugs. You've hugged me, Victor, right? I don't necessarily know if you've asked me, right, for a hug, but I hug you because you're somebody I'm familiar with, and it's all love. But so when I talk about the idea of nuance, it comes to those day to day things that may be innocuous to us, right? That maybe we need to be mindful of, or maybe not. Now shifting gears, I don't want to keep y'all on for 5 hours. This is how we end up in the group for as long as we do. I want to talk about the idea of accountability, because I think in the podcast that we were referencing earlier, they were talking about how do you hold people accountable when it comes to the idea of behaviors associated with rape culture. So I could say for me, using I statements, right? I haven't been one to always hold my peers accountable, because I wasn't comfortable in self. I wasn't comfortable in the relationships that I had, right? I was worried about peer acceptance, And so we talk about those ages during your formative years. So we're talking about, adolescence and during your teens and your 20s. So if we're out at a club and a homie of mine, he likes to just kiss girls on the mouth, right? And we think it's funny. And then it's like as we evolve, I become more comfortable in self to even speak out about it, because again, laughing is being in agreement with the behavior. And so for me, I know personally, again, this idea of accountability took for me to become comfortable with self. And now where I am is it's just like, nah, that's not cool. Right. Or even with myself. Listen, I might touch somebody on the shoulder. I might say, "Oh, did you ask for consent? Did you ask them how they're feeling?" Right. And not just assume. So what does accountability look like for you guys? I guess we can start with you, Mike, because you've been kind of quiet over there.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing is that, kind of jumping off what you just said with not minimizing men in the conversation, is that we don't just want to hold individual people accountable. This also comes back to what Zane was talking about with everything being transactional, is we have to hold society accountable. This is a societal problem that is constantly messaged and taught to everybody in society, right? So it's not just, I got to call someone out. I have to, now this might be the social worker in me coming out, but I have to look at how do I affect change to the systems of oppression that are in this country? Because listen, the way it's set up, misogyny, patriarchy, that benefits the top, right? And not having difficult conversations. And listen, why aren't parents having the difficult conversation? Is it just that they're uncomfortable, or is it because they're working 2 jobs? Is it because they don't have enough money to get by? Is it because they're scratching through poverty? So for me, accountability is, yes, I may be a social worker, but guess what? I also think of myself as a sex educator, right? And that means I need to be teaching consent, right? I need to be teaching autonomy. Just for a shout out, there's a lot of good books out there right now for kids. And I'm talking about age 6 and up, that really do a good job of illustrating consent, illustrating gender diversity, illustrating body diversity, that are great tools that parents can use to minimize the uncomfortability, right? Because you can actually point to a book that's doing it for you. So yeah, and then in friend reactions, I've always been I'm not afraid of an uncomfortable conversation. Simple as that. I won't call out, but I will dig, right? I will push us to a point where there's a point for learning. And then for myself, for accountability, I start with my wife, right? If my wife calls me out on something that's residue from the patriarchal society I live in, I leave myself open to learn. Simple as that. Yeah. I don't get defensive. I go, this is a learning moment. You got to learn from this.
Yeah, but go ahead, Dr. Ross. I want to get your take on just this idea. I know you got to get ready to roll. Seeing as though it's 9:30, man, we roll. I appreciate your brother's time. So just this idea of accountability, and I'll throw allyship in for you since your time is running low.
No, I appreciate it, dear brother. And I think I echo what Michael's saying, is that accountability starts with you individually. And I love what you said earlier. We're not perfect people, and we can't expect ourselves to be perfect. But if we're growing and evolving as people, as humans, as men, we have to look at our emotional intelligence. And that's what I was thinking about as Tyrone and Zane were talking about. You thinking about our own emotional intelligence and being able to read and understand the situations that we're in. That will help us. But if we can't hold anybody else accountable until we start holding ourselves accountable, because what happens if we're going to be beacons of light for men around the world, we don't want stones being cast back at us, right? You can't call people out and be like, yo, dog, that's some horrible behavior. Then they can point their finger. Well, remember when you were doing this? I just saw you doing that. And so I think a level of accountability starts with, how are you working every day to be the best version of yourself when it comes to your interactions with people? And how are you limiting and working to not dehumanize people? I think when it comes to allyship, as my homeboy talks about, you have to have empathy. And you only work through empathy by living and walking as much as you can in other people's shoes. And so listening to people, right? Listening to people and their lived experiences and going out, right, with them. Being in spaces that you may be uncomfortable with, right? And so I have a good friend. When we travel, you know, we make sure to go to gay bars. So I can actually, feel that level of uncomfort. Like he's like, we're always doing heterosexual things, right? For me to understand what it means to be a gay man, right? It means that I have to sit in my discomfort to learn empathy so I can be an ally. Because if you can't do that, if you have no empathy for the other people's lived experiences, you can't be an ally. You can't be an accomplice. You can't be a partner.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you bring up a great point when we talk about the idea of empathy, especially when it comes to men. I forgot what study I was reading. But it was just like, especially when it comes to men, right? You have to relate if you want them to truly empathize, you have to relate the experience to an experience that they've experienced, right? And you see the connection take place where they say it might click, right? Instead of saying, oh, you should feel, or yo, you need to be more mindful of this, but it's no. Remember when you felt like X, Y, and Z during this experience. Now imagine how they might feel, right? And so the study showed that the level of empathy that came for the individual for the situation, it rose exponentially. And so again, that's something to be mindful of, because again, for some, it may be just a disconnect that may be taking place as to why we might not be empathizing with the survivor, right? It just has to be, and I think that goes not only for just men, for people in general. If you can make it relatable, right? If you can make it to them specifically, like we could talk about that with this whole COVID-19, right? You still see a lot of people out here saying, yo, F it. I mean, I'm out here. But then when it hits your backyard, that's when it starts to really start to resonate. Right. So I think you bring up a great point when you talk about this idea of empathy. Listen, brother, I always appreciate you. Make sure everybody tunes into the What's Your Revolution podcast, available on all streaming platforms. Thanks, Dr. Charles.
Man, it's always
Dr. Charles, nice
Thank you.
meeting
Have a
you.
good one, man.
Yeah,
Nice meeting you, man.
You too, brothers. Hey, Phil, I just want to say, man, you're doing amazing things, brother. Keep up the work. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you. Keep spreading your word and knowledge, man. You're a blessing to the world.
I appreciate you, brother. Appreciate you.
All right. Y'all be good.
Peace.
You too.
All right.
So I think we talked to Mike. So now this idea of, and I think we could lump them in together, because I know, Zane, you probably got to get ready to go to work. This ain't the group.
Yep.
All y'all are members of the group that come through, so you know how we get. We might be sitting there for 3.5 hours till Uncle Bobby's close. But just to get your perspective on this idea of accountability and allyship before we wrap up.
So for myself, when we're talking about accountability and ally, a lot of times I use my own situation to kind of identify, to kind of help people identify, and I do that by storytelling, being vulnerable. That vulnerability and storytelling has allowed people to kind of gravitate towards me and kind of like taking stock what's being said to them. Because anybody that knows me, I give you the ugly about me in my past behavior. So I'm the poster child of bad boy, or that kind of bad behavior, or that womanizing, or all those things I talk about. So it's literally, I'm not one to shy away from what I would consider to be those tough conversations. I have no problem calling someone out on behavior that I consider to be inappropriate. And a lot of times I use those conversations, and Phil, we've talked about the celebrities, how people give them a pass because of their celebrity, or because they look like us. I don't give anybody a pass. For me, it's either right or wrong. You don't get a pass because you have $1 million in your account and you're a celebrity. Bad behavior is bad behavior, because your behavior can be harmful to someone else. And that harm can impact someone else in a way that doesn't allow for them to recover for X amount of time. It might. So I talk about all the ugly stuff. And in terms of ally, I think it's important for us to become allies, to practice allyship, and to even show our vulnerability to women and support women in a way that allows them to see, hey, not all men are like that. There are some good brothers out there. There are some brothers that are changing their behavior because they're changing their messaging. You know, I think having these conversations, we've all taught each other something in those groups that we didn't know prior to going to the group. So I think it's going to take a lot of conversations, a collection of conversations. It's going to take a lot of vulnerability and a lot of empathy. As the doc said, it's going to take a whole lot of empathy and being mindful of where other people are at and where they're not at, and then being sensitive to what they're struggling with. All those things are important to our healing communities. It's really important. You
Word.
know, I share my sensitivity. I mean, the good, bad, and ugly, and
Yeah.
I think that helps other brothers identify with me because they see that I'm not wearing a mask. I took my mask off a long time ago. You know, so I talk about those ugly feelings, and I think it's okay to be uncomfortable and uncertain as men. We have to talk about these things because it gives men permission, and we get an opportunity to create safe spaces where men can say,
Yeah.
"Oh, wow, I thought it was just me."
Yeah, yeah. Again, and hence the reason why we have the group, we have Mondays, just because again, we recognize that we live in a what does Bell Hooks call it? Patriarchal, capitalistic, white supremacy,
White society.
patriarchal, capitalistic society, right? But still, we still catch the short end of the stick at
WT.
times, no doubt.
Hmm.
And so it's important where we can be amongst one another. No, the language might not be perfect, right? But I
Right.
think we need to focus in on the desire, right? The desire to learn, the desire to want to quote unquote be better. Like we really need to
Change.
honor that, right? We could work on how it comes across, and again, but and you guys know that I use the example of that. If a brother comes to the group, he might say, "This bitch get on my nerves." We know in outside society, in general society, listen, he's going to be shamed to the point where he's not going to even want to even discuss further as to what he means, right? And so, yes, we can address the B word, but first we want to understand, well, why is she getting on your nerves? And then what makes you so comfortable to call her the B word, right? But we
Hmm.
have to allow people the opportunity. And I think where we are as a society, no, we live in cancel culture. If you say one wrong word, we hopping down your throat, and we miss the forest for the trees. You know what I'm saying? So no, definitely appreciate you, brothers. Zane, I did give you an opportunity to go.
No, I mean, I agree with. I think I'm working. I think by working on myself and trying to see where I can be better,
Hmm.
a better empath, a better understanding myself and how my actions affect other people. And I'm not afraid of an intense conversation. You know that. So when I do have the opportunity to, have conversations that counter aggressive male culture or ways we see women, I do. And then sometimes I choose not to, and that's in context. You know what I mean? Is people that, well, I'm not going to make excuses for myself. So sometimes I think I have to get better at that, when to engage, when not to engage. But I think when I feel safe to engage, I engage. And when I put a magnifying glass up against myself, I think that's helpful too. You know what I mean? So holding myself accountable, holding people that are close to me accountable, and then trying to learn from my mistakes, and also trying to grow with every conversation that I have. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm 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 always trying to be better at understanding somebody else's situation.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess wait. I don't know if Mike, you got an opportunity. I know you talked about accountability. Did you want to comment on allyship
Yeah,
before we wrap up?
from allyship, I mean, I think Dr. Charles hit on a good point with the empathy idea. And the one thing that's happened in our society is we have gotten so diverse in our identities, right? So diverse. But we've also, through that diversity, we've become very inclusive communities that are very small, right? And sometimes we're not able to interact in some way because there is less space, right? We don't allow messiness in learning when it comes to this stuff, like you talked about with the cancel culture.
Yeah.
But I think, like, for me, it's honoring another human, right? Whatever their humanity expresses itself as, whatever their path has been, I expect to greet every person I greet that they have some kind of trauma in their background, right? It's almost guaranteed. So if I'm approaching somebody as if they're dealing with some kind of trauma or some kind of struggle, I'm going to come from a space where I'm going to be careful in my language, where I'm going to be careful in the way I emote, where I'm going to be careful in my verbal, like nonverbal. How am I standing? Am I standing in an aggressive way? So I think for me, like, that's kind of like my lead is like, expect that someone's dealing with something and approach in the right way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Word. And I guess I'll wrap it up by saying, when we talk about this idea of accountability, I mean, again, I always run every scenario through my head 1,000 times, and even then, I still might not get it right. But I holding myself accountable, but not holding myself hostage by some of the decisions that I may make out here. Because again, we're human, we are fallible. Surrounding myself with people who will hold me accountable. I know my women friends. I don't think I was the one that said female. You know what I mean? Because I think I done got skewered like 75 times by Kosowa and by Stephanie and a few other women who I look to for guidance in certain areas, as well as other brothers, right? So again, it's surrounding myself with people who also have a desire to not only grow themselves, but to see me grow. I think who you surround yourself means a lot. But again, I can't begrudge somebody who's not in that position to surround themselves with people to see them grow, right? Because we talked about social workers. Mike hit on it. Recognizing that everybody's trauma is different, everybody's timeline is different, right? And still holding space and that grace necessary for them. So while still in the midst of having teachable moments with others and what have you, even if right then in that moment they might not get it. So they might not get it the first time, but I can't afford to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The good homie Greg Corbin, he always says, listen, we can't cancel people, black folk, especially because we can't afford to, right? We're not necessarily in a position where we can, right? So yes, we might want more for our brother and for our sister, but we're just not necessarily in a position, especially where I am as a person in my growth and what I said that my desire and what my passion is, which is helping other people, right? When we talk about allyship, again, echoing of what Dr. Charles said, this idea of empathy, recognizing that, other people's life experiences matter.
It does.
Right. They matter. They might not necessarily be mine. I might not necessarily agree with their choices, their life decisions, but still taking that into account when I'm showing up in another's life. Right. And so, again, it's just not being a bystander. Not being a bystander. I was a bystander for a very long time. And so what I recognized for me personally, I had to unlearn a lot of the unhealthy tenets that hip hop taught me. Because again, I talk about that being one of the biggest influencers for black males. And just recognizing again that if I desire to have healthy relationships with people, then I can't afford not to be an ally. Right? Again, we talk about this transactional piece. We all desire to get to a certain place. And so even at a basic level, if we're talking about transactional, it'll pay for me to be an ally and not be an opposition to another person at a bare minimum. Right? So yeah, and just respecting the humanity in others, man. Listen, I appreciate you all. Mike, Tyrone, Zane. I appreciate you brothers for tuning in. I appreciate the listeners for tuning in for this hour and 45 minutes. I think it was a great conversation. It never ends here. This is an ongoing conversation. That's another way that we continue to be allies or hold people accountable, by continuing to have these uncomfortable conversations. I know some of the comments had me in my feelings for a second, right? But I had to I keep it real because I'm human, but I had to take a step back, right? And say, listen, if somebody offering pushback, that's a beautiful thing, right? Because if I say my goal and my desire is to grow, right? How can I not at least think about it? How can I not at least think about it? So again, I appreciate you all for tuning in. To everybody else, listen, I'll be back tomorrow. I think I got Jay Barnett on tomorrow. I got to hit the brother up. He is a marriage and family therapist. We'll be talking about his free 4-week program offering counseling to men in the form of group therapy. You can tune in on Facebook Live, on YouTube Live at Quantify LLC. We are back tomorrow at 8 p.m. Peace. Hit that subscribe button. Where my Dr. Umar joint? I ain't got it, but it's going to be on the YouTube video for tomorrow. Listen, we gave y'all some good information. Don't just give me $10. Give me $20 on the Cash App. Cash tag Quantify LLC. I appreciate you all. Peace.